Don't sign that, Ava said quietly, but the sound of a billionaire's pen tapping against glass drowned her out before the words could fully land. The boardroom on the 47th floor shimmered with polished steel and floor-to-ceiling windows stretching across a Manhattan skyline. The late afternoon sun cutting sharp lines across the table where executives sat frozen in anticipation, waiting for Richard Whitmore to finalize a deal worth over $300 million, his signature hovering just inches above the paper as if the entire future of his empire balanced on that single motion. Ava stood near the back wall, badge clipped crookedly to her blazer. A temporary analyst no one had bothered to remember, her fingers still curled from the moment she stepped forward uninvited, her voice steady but ignored as Richard glanced at her only briefly, the corner of his mouth lifting in a thin, dismissive smile that never quite reached his eyes. "We've reviewed this 6 times, he said, his tone calm. "Practiced, final," and the room responded with small nods and quiet agreement, the kind that comes from people who trust power more than truth. Ava's gaze didn't move from the document, her mind tracing the clause again, the hidden shift buried under layers of legal language, a subtle pivot that transferred risk so completely it would hollow out everything Richard believed he controlled. But when she spoke again, softer this time, no one turned, not even the junior associates who had noticed her. "Step forward." The air felt heavier now, like the moment before a storm no one else could see. The hum of the overhead lights pressing against her ears as Richard lowered the pen, the faint scratch of ink against paper echoing louder than it should have in a room this large. Across the glass, the city moved on unaware, cars inching through traffic, sunlight glinting off distant buildings, while inside, something invisible had already begun to shift. Ava exhaled slowly, her shoulders still, her expression unreadable, not fear, not regret, just a quiet certainty that settled deeper with each passing second. Richard capped his pen with a soft click, sliding the document forward as a ripple of restrained applause moved around the table, controlled, polite, confident, and for a brief moment, it seemed like everything had gone exactly as planned. Then a screen flickered, just once at first, barely noticeable, a brief glitch in the corner of the main display, but Ava's eyes lifted immediately, her focus sharpening as the light shifted again, brighter this time, harsher, unnatural against the clean lines of the room. Richard didn't notice. Not yet, his attention already moving to the next step, the next deal, the next win. But Ava remained still, watching, the reflection of the screen beginning to glow faintly in her eyes as the system behind the glass walls started to respond to something no one else had seen coming. The flicker sharpened into a steady pulse as one screen after another turned from clean blue to warning red, the glow spreading across the glass walls like a silent alarm no one had planned for. And the room shifted without anyone saying a word, chairs creaking slightly as executives leaned forward, eyes narrowing, confusion replacing confidence in a matter of seconds. Richard paused mid-sentence, his voice trailing off as he followed their gaze, the reflection of the flashing alert catching in the polished surface of the table before he finally looked up, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as bold letters filled the main display. System access restricted, external audit initiated, multiple accounts under review, the words stacking in layers that made no immediate sense, yet carried a weight that pressed into the room. Someone reached for a tablet, tapping quickly. Another whispered to legal across the table, their voice too low to fully catch, but sharp with urgency, and still no one moved decisively, as if waiting for Richard to dismiss it all with a single command. Ava remained where she was, back straight, hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing slow and even, watching the sequence unfold with the same quiet focus she had held minutes earlier, the pattern confirming itself piece by piece in front of her, exactly the way she had traced it in her mind. Richard stood slowly, not rushed, not panicked, but no longer entirely composed, his jaw tightening as he adjusted his cufflinks out of habit more than necessity, the small gesture grounding him while the room looked to him for direction, for certainty, for control. But the systems did not respond to confidence, and the alerts did not fade. His phone vibrated against the table, once, then again, then continuously, a low mechanical hum that cut through the silence, and when he finally picked it up, The shift in his eyes was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, the first crack in a presence that had never allowed doubt to show. He did not speak right away, just listened, his gaze drifting briefly across the room before landing, almost involuntarily, on Ava, still standing at the edge of the glass wall, still not moving, and for a fraction of a second, something unspoken passed between them, not accusation, not triumph, just recognition. Around them, the boardroom began to lose its symmetry, voices rising slightly, questions overlapping, the neat structure of authority dissolving into uncertainty as reports started to come in, numbers fluctuating, access revoked, partners unreachable, and through it all, the sunlight outside remained unchanged, pouring through the windows as if nothing inside had shifted at all. Richard lowered the phone slowly, placing it back on the table with more care than before, his fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary, and when he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but no longer dismissive, not directed at the room this time, not even at the executives waiting for answers, but toward the one person who had spoken before any of this began, his words measured, deliberate, and carrying a weight that had not been there before as he said, "You knew something." And the silence that followed felt different, no longer confident, no longer comfortable, but open, uncertain, and waiting. No one spoke immediately after his words settled into the air, and for a moment it felt as though the entire room had narrowed to the space between Richard and Ava, the distance no more than 15 feet, yet suddenly heavier than everything that had just unfolded. Ava did not rush to answer, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accepted that this moment would come long before anyone else even noticed the risk. And when she finally stepped forward, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor seemed louder than the overlapping alerts still flashing across the screens. "It was in the liability structure," she said calmly, her voice clear but not raised, not defensive, just precise. And a few heads turned toward her now with a different kind of attention, no longer dismissive but searching, as if trying to reconcile the person they had ignored with the reality unfolding around them. Richard watched her closely, not interrupting this time, his expression controlled but no longer certain, his focus sharper, more deliberate. As she continued, "The clause was written to look balanced, but it shifted long-term responsibility entirely onto your side once the deal triggered secondary conditions." And she gestured lightly toward the document still lying on the table, untouched now, almost irrelevant compared to what it had set in motion. One of the executives leaned in, flipping quickly through a digital copy, his fingers moving faster now, urgency replacing confidence, while another whispered something about compliance and risk exposure, their voices low but tense, the structure of authority quietly rearranging itself in real time. Ava did not look at them, her attention remaining on Richard, not confrontational, not challenging, simply present, as if she was offering information rather than proving a point. "Once that clause activated," she added, "any irregularity on their side becomes your full responsibility, including external audits." And her eyes lifted briefly toward the red warnings still pulsing across the screens, confirming what she had already known before the pen ever touched the paper. Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight of the explanation settling in as the pieces aligned, his mind moving through the implications with the speed of someone used to solving problems. But this time the solution was already behind him, not ahead, and the realization carried a different kind of silence. His phone vibrated again. And this time he did not reach for it immediately, his attention fixed on Ava as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the room, about control, about who held clarity and who had been overlooked. Around them, the tension shifted again, no longer confusion but recognition. A quiet acknowledgement spreading across the table as more people began to understand what had happened, their earlier confidence dissolving into something more cautious, more aware. Ava stopped speaking, not because she had nothing more to say, but because she had said enough, her hands resting naturally at her sides, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, and in that stillness there was no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet consistency that had been there from the beginning. Richard finally nodded once, a small movement but deliberate, his voice lower now, stripped of the certainty it carried before, as he said. And you tried to tell me, not as a question, but as a recognition of something he could no longer deny, and the room, once filled with controlled certainty, now held a different kind of silence, one that listened. Richard did not look away, but the weight behind his gaze had changed, no longer the detached confidence of someone in control, but the focused attention of someone recalculating everything in real time. And for a brief second, the room held its breath as if waiting to see whether he would retreat into authority or step into something unfamiliar. The alerts continued to pulse across the screens, steady and indifferent, while distant sirens from the city below faintly filtered through the glass, grounding the moment in a reality that no one in the room could ignore anymore. One of the senior executives cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "We need to contact legal immediately," he said, his voice tighter now, stripped of earlier composure, and another added, "We may still be able to contain this if we act fast." But the urgency in their words no longer carried certainty, only reaction. Richard raised a hand slightly, not abruptly, just enough to quiet the overlapping voices, and the room responded instinctively, falling back into silence. But this time it was a different kind of silence, not built on confidence but on tension, on awareness. He turned fully toward Ava now, closing the physical distance by a few measured steps, his presence still commanding but no longer dismissive. And when he spoke again, his tone was controlled yet deliberate. "Walk me through it," he said, not as an order, but as a request shaped by necessity. And that shift did not go unnoticed by anyone watching. Ava nodded once, not surprised, not hesitant, just steady, and moved closer to the table, her eyes briefly scanning the document again, as if confirming details she already understood, her fingers resting lightly on the edge without claiming space. "The clause activates after the initial transaction clears," she explained, her voice even. "But it is tied to secondary compliance triggers that are vague on purpose, which means any audit like this one gives them legal room to step back while everything stays with you." And as she spoke, a few executives leaned in further, following her explanation more closely now, their earlier assumptions unraveling with each word. Richard listened without interruption, his expression tightening slightly, not from anger but from recognition, the kind that comes when a mistake is no longer theoretical but measurable, real, unfolding. His phone buzzed again, louder this time against the table, and one of his assistants hesitated before sliding it closer to him. But he did not pick it up. Not yet. His attention fixed on Ava as if the rest of the world could wait for just a few seconds longer. "And there is no safeguard?" he asked, his voice lower, more focused, and Ava met his gaze directly, not challenging, just honest. "There was," she said softly, "before the signature." And the simplicity of that answer settled into the room heavier than any of the flashing alerts. A quiet ripple moved across the table. Not panic. Not yet. But something deeper. The realization that this was not a problem to solve forward, but one that had already locked into place. Richard's shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly, the smallest physical sign that the control he carried so naturally was adjusting under pressure. And when he finally reached for his phone, his grip was firm but measured, his voice steady as he answered, already stepping into the consequences he could not undo. But before he turned away completely, his eyes flicked back to Ava once more, holding there for a fraction longer than before, as if acknowledging not just what she had seen, but what he had failed to hear. The call lasted less than 10 seconds, but when Richard lowered the phone, the shift was undeniable, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet recalibration that everyone in the room could feel without needing it explained. "They pulled out," he said, his voice steady but stripped of any remaining illusion, and the words settled like weight across the table, immediate, irreversible. As screens continued to flicker with updated notices, compliance flags multiplying, financial projections recalculating in real time, each number shifting further from what had been expected just minutes ago. One executive leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath. Another pressed both hands flat against the table as if grounding himself, while a junior associate stared at the data feed, blinking rapidly as the implications caught up to him. The room that once held controlled confidence now carried a tension that moved differently, sharper, more personal, no longer abstract risk, but visible. Consequence. Richard remained standing, his posture still composed, but there was a stillness to him now that had not been there before, a deliberate pause as if choosing each next move carefully instead of assuming it would work. Legal is already engaged, he continued, not looking at anyone in particular. But the structure locks us in. And even as he said it, the reality of those words echoed back against everything he had built his reputation on: precision, foresight, control. Ava did not move, her gaze lowering briefly to the document before lifting again, not to correct, not to challenge, simply to observe as the situation unfolded exactly as she had anticipated. Around her, the subtle distance that once separated her from the table had shifted, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, but not fully accepted either, suspended in that uncertain space where perception changes but is not yet settled. One of the partners finally spoke, his tone cautious. "We can manage the narrative if we act fast." But the suggestion sounded thinner now, less certain, as if even he knew that this was not just about perception anymore. Richard's eyes moved across the room, assessing, calculating. But each solution seemed to meet the same fixed point. The signature already written, the clause already active, the outcome already in motion. He stepped closer to the window, the city stretching out beneath him in steady, indifferent movement, sunlight reflecting off distant buildings in sharp lines that contrasted with the shifting uncertainty inside. For a moment, he said nothing, his reflection faint against the glass. A man used to directing outcomes now standing inside one he could not redirect. Behind him, the alerts continued their quiet rhythm, a constant reminder that time was moving forward whether they were ready or not. Then he turned back, slower this time, his attention settling again on Ava, not as an interruption, not as an afterthought, but as the one person who had seen this before it happened. And when he spoke, the edge that once carried authority had softened into something more measured, more grounded. "Is there anything we can still do?" he asked, and it was not just a question about the situation, but about whether control could still be reclaimed at all. And the silence that followed held the answer waiting. The question did not echo the way his earlier words had. It settled instead, quiet and deliberate, as if the room itself understood that whatever answer came next would not be shaped by authority or urgency, but by truth. And Ava held his gaze for a moment before shifting her eyes back to the table, to the document that now felt heavier than its weight in paper, her fingers resting lightly near its edge without touching it, as if even that small contact might acknowledge something already sealed. "Not in the way you are hoping," she said, her voice calm, measured, carrying no hesitation, and no one interrupted. Not this time, not even the executives, who only minutes ago would have dismissed her without a second thought. The hum of the building's ventilation system became more noticeable in the silence, a low steady current beneath everything else, while outside the windows the light had softened slightly, the late afternoon beginning its slow shift toward evening, casting longer reflections across the glass walls that framed the room. Richard did not react immediately, his expression remaining composed, but there was a stillness in his posture now, a kind of internal pause as he absorbed the answer without resistance, without deflection, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not look for a way around it. Ava continued, not to extend the moment, but because clarity required it. "You can slow the damage," she said, her tone even. "Work with legal, cooperate fully with the audit, and limit how far it spreads. But the structure itself will not reverse." And as she spoke, one of the executives nodded faintly, already recognizing the logic in her words, the shift from control to containment, from expansion to preservation. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath almost imperceptible, but enough to mark the transition from reaction to acceptance, his eyes lowering briefly to the table before lifting again, no longer searching for contradiction, only understanding. The room did not rush to fill the silence that followed. No one offered quick solutions or reassurances, because none would hold. And in that quiet, something else began to settle, not defeat, but awareness, a recalibration of how power and insight had been measured only moments before. Ava stepped back slightly, not retreating, simply returning to the space she had occupied earlier, her presence unchanged even as the perception of her shifted around the room, and the distance between her and the table felt different now. Not exclusion, not hierarchy, just space. Richard glanced once more at the screens, the steady pulse of alerts no longer startling, just present, part of the reality he was now stepping into. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried less weight of command and more weight of intention. "Then we start there," he said. Quietly, not to the room, not to the executives, but as a decision spoken into existence. And as he turned slightly toward the door, already preparing for what came next, his eyes paused briefly on Ava, holding for a fraction longer than before, not with surprise this time, but with recognition that had finally found its place. The room did not move with urgency anymore. It shifted with purpose, quieter, sharper, as if every person inside had stepped into a different version of the same moment, one where assumptions no longer held weight and every word carried consequence. Richard remained still for a second longer than expected, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, fingers relaxed but deliberate, before he straightened fully and turned back toward the screens, not to question them, but to read them, as they were, without resistance. "Pull every related contract tied to this structure," he said, his voice even, grounded, and this time when people moved, they did so without hesitation, laptops opening, calls being placed, instructions flowing outward with a clarity that came from acceptance rather than control. Ava watched the shift without stepping forward again, her role complete in the moment, yet still present in its aftermath, her eyes following the data streams as they updated, confirming patterns, tracing connections that others were only beginning to recognize. One of the analysts near the far end spoke up, his tone cautious but focused. "There are at least 3 subsidiary agreements linked to the same clause framework," and the information landed quickly, expanding the scope of what had already begun, while another voice added, "If those trigger as well, exposure increases across multiple divisions," the words stacking not as panic but as reality, each layer clearer than the last. Richard nodded once, absorbing the expansion without visible strain, his attention moving between speakers and screens, his presence no longer defined by dominance but by alignment. And in that shift, something deeper settled into the room, a recalibration of what leadership looked like when certainty was no longer an option. He glanced briefly toward Ava. Again, not seeking validation, but acknowledging the origin of the clarity now guiding every decision. And then he spoke, quieter this time, but carrying further. "Then we address all of it." And the simplicity of the statement cut through the complexity surrounding them, grounding it in action. Outside the glass, the sky had begun to dim slightly, the golden light fading into a softer gray that mirrored the tone inside, less sharp, more reflective, while the city continued its steady rhythm. Below, unchanged, distant, Ava shifted her weight subtly, her hands folding loosely in front of her, her breathing even, as if the intensity of the moment had never unsettled her, only confirmed what she already understood. An executive approached Richard with a tablet, highlighting projected losses, timelines, regulatory steps, and Richard scanned it quickly, his eyes moving with precision, no longer searching for flaws in the system, but mapping the path forward through it. "We are not hiding this," he said after a brief pause, his voice firm but not forceful. "We respond, we cooperate, and we stabilize." And the directive moved through the room with a different kind of authority, one built not on assumption, but on clarity. Ava looked toward the window for a moment, the reflection of the room faint against the glass, and then back to the table, her presence still quiet, still grounded, as the consequences unfolded exactly as they needed to. And somewhere within that unfolding, the truth she had carried from the beginning no longer needed to be proven. It had simply become undeniable. The movement in the room gradually softened into a steady rhythm, no longer reactive, no longer uncertain, just deliberate, as if every person had accepted their role in what came next. And in that shift, the tension that once filled the space began to thin, replaced by something quieter, more grounded. Richard stepped away from the table and moved toward the center of the room again, not with urgency, but with intention, his posture straight, his expression composed in a way that no longer relied on control but on clarity. And when he stopped, he did not address the room immediately, his gaze moving once more toward Ava, who remained near the glass wall, still, present, unchanged. For a moment, the distance between them felt smaller than before, not in space, but in understanding, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the dismissal that had defined it earlier, only a quiet acknowledgement that settled into the room with weight. "You saw it before any of us did," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, but as a simple truth that no longer needed explanation. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her shoulders relaxed, as if the recognition did not elevate her, only confirmed what had already been there, and she gave a slight nod, not claiming anything, not pushing forward, just present in the moment as it unfolded. Around them, the executives continued their work, voices lower now, more focused, the earlier urgency transformed into precision, each task moving forward with intention, but the center of the room remained anchored in that brief exchange, quiet and steady. Richard took a step closer, not crossing into her space, but enough to shift the dynamic once more, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a depth that had not been there before. "I should have listened," he said, the words measured, not dramatic, not forced, just honest, and the simplicity of them carried further than anything louder could have. No one reacted outwardly, but the room absorbed it, the acknowledgement settling into the space like a final adjustment, aligning everything that had been out of place. Ava's eyes softened slightly, not in response to the apology, but in recognition of the shift behind it, and when she answered, her voice remained steady, unchanged. "You are listening now," she said quietly, and the words did not challenge or correct. They simply met the moment where it stood. Richard held that for a second, then nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried acceptance, not of the situation alone, but of the perspective he had overlooked. The light outside the windows had dimmed further, the city now reflecting a cooler tone across the glass, the brightness of earlier replaced by a softer glow that spread evenly through the room, touching every surface without distinction. Ava stepped back slightly, returning fully to her place near the wall, not out of retreat, but because there was nothing more to add, nothing more to prove, and as she did, the room continued forward, systems updating, voices coordinating, actions unfolding in quiet sequence. Richard turned away at last, not dismissing her, not overlooking her, but carrying that moment with him as he moved toward the next decision. His presence no longer defined by distance, but by awareness, and behind him, Ava remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, steady, observant, and finally seen. The room slowly returned to a quieter state, not because the situation had resolved, but because everyone inside it had adjusted to the truth it revealed, and in that adjustment, the sharp edges of urgency softened into a steady forward motion, deliberate and grounded. The screens still glowed with updates, numbers shifting, systems recalibrating, but they no longer dictated the mood. They simply reflected it, a constant backdrop to decisions now made with awareness rather than assumption. Richard stood near the head of the table, reviewing a final set of notes handed to him, his movements precise, controlled, but different now, less driven by certainty and more by intention, as if each action carried a weight he had not acknowledged before. Across the room, Ava remained by the glass wall, her reflection faint against the dimming city outside, her posture relaxed, her presence quiet, unchanged by everything that had unfolded, and yet the space around her no longer treated her as invisible. It held her differently, with a subtle awareness that had not been there before. One by one, the executives gathered their materials, their voices low as they coordinated next steps, no longer trying to outpace the situation, but moving with it, understanding its limits, and in that understanding, there was a calm that did not come from control, but from clarity. Richard closed the folder in his hands and set it down gently, the sound soft against the table, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to stand still, his gaze lifting toward the windows where the last light of the day stretched across the skyline in muted tones, the city below continuing as it always had, indifferent, constant. He turned once more, not to address the room, but to look toward Ava, his eyes holding there without urgency, without expectation, just recognition. And then he gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, simply real, before stepping away, moving toward the door with the same steady pace he had carried all day, but with a different presence guiding it. Ava watched him go, not following, not calling out, her expression calm, her breathing even, as the door opened and closed with a quiet finality that marked the end of the moment more than any words could. The room did not rush to fill the silence that followed. It settled into it, the kind of silence that does not need explanation, only space. And in that stillness, the reflections in the glass walls became clearer, showing not just the city outside, but the people within, each one carrying a slightly different understanding of what had just taken place. Ava turned her gaze outward for a moment, the lights of the city beginning to flicker on one by one, small points of brightness against the deepening sky. And then she looked back toward the table, now half